Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Pretty good.
To begin with, can you say your name?
My name is, my legal name is Thanh Uyen but you can call me Tanya. Mhm.
And do you mind taking us back to 1975, before the end of the war?
Okay.
Could you describe for us your life at that time?
Okay, my life is, was a 8-year-old child. I was the older sister of a family of 4 kids. So my mom and dad are just regular folks. Okay, my dad worked in, he's a Navy officer. My mom was a stay-home mom. And I went to grade 2, going on to grade 3. And life is pretty normal. We lived in a military compound. So I remember just going to school, going home, playing with my siblings and the neighbors and stuff like that. Nothing, I was too young to experience too much, right? But I could remember we had a little bunker in our house, and it was made from, it was filled with sand, and it was made of old boxes where you stored bullets. My dad would take those home, fill it up with sand, and we'd make a bunker out of that. Yeah, and that's about it. Yeah.
And where in the city? Sorry, what city were you in?
It was a port, a seaside port, Mita. Yeah. So Mita is, I remember, is I don't know how many hours away from Saigon, but it was a Navy port, just a small one, right? Yeah. I remember when we were little, I believe we lived with my grandparents in Saigon. So when we got to grade 1 and grade 2, my mom started to bring us to live with my dad. So I lived in Da Nang for maybe a year or two, and then he was stationed in Mita, so we moved to Mita to stay there, and that's where we stayed until the day we left.
So where did your grandparents live?
My grandparents lived in Saigon.
Okay, that was your home base.
That was my home. Yes. Yeah.
And did he was he absent a lot, either at sea or at the station at different bases?
I don't remember. I think when we were little, I think he worked quite a bit, so he wasn't stationed anywhere. So once he was stationed somewhere for a year or so, my mom would bring us, the family, to stay with him. So I remember being 4 or 5 years old, living in Da Nang for a year or two, and that was interesting. And then we went to Mito. I was old enough to remember, 7, 8 years old. I was old enough to remember going to school, grade 1, grade 2, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what do you remember of the final days of the war?
What it was that we would go to school, but sometime on the way to school we would hear missiles firing, okay, above us. We didn't think anything of it. We would hear the missiles coming and going, and you would hear people. We were too little, so we didn't know too much. But we had friends outside our compound, because the Navy was different and the Army was different too. And sometime we would go visit people, and we would see military trucks and ambulance carrying bodies when they after, I don't know how to describe it, when there's let's say, I don't know, because I would see trucks go by and there would be the ambulance that would carry people, but it wasn't a real ambulance. It was open air. It was those you carry people after, you see people from the war, and after the airplane would take them, or the helicopter would take them and transport to the hospital. I've seen people being transported on the road to the hospital, right?
It was just that day, or was that a routine?
Once in a while,
occurrence?
because if we went outside of the area where we lived, we went into the Army. So our area was a Navy compound, and outside that area was the Army, right? They're different. So those ones we saw, but as a little child, you didn't think of anything of it. You didn't think. We knew that people were injured, okay? But the war, we would see on TV. We would see people running for their lives. We would see pictures on TV, but it didn't seem real. Do you know what I mean? So I, as a child, would hear, my parents would say, we watched TV, and we would see that certain cities were lost, and then people had to flee, right, as refugees from one town to the other. But we lived so far south, right? So it didn't affect us as yet. So we just, lived very innocently, didn't have any worries, and my parents were just doing their normal thing, right? But I remember a few days before we left, I remember my dad was getting ready to to evacuate, right? So my dad was just a Navy officer, but what I can remember as a very young child, you eavesdrop, you hear things, and he was in charge of. He was very handy. He was a mechanic, right? He fixed boats and ship, and his job was to supply these ships with gasoline and supplies, right? And so I overheard my mom and dad saying that he told my mom just to get ready, get some food, some supplies, because we had small children. My brothers and sisters were like 4 or 5, and very little, 20 months. So my mom would buy crackers. She would buy a little bit of supplies, just in case we had to flee, because near the end of the middle of April, right? There were signs that things were happening, and so you always have to be prepared. There's Plan A. If you lose the war, Plan B. So you had to evacuate. So my mom bought things, but she wasn't she wasn't fully committed. She just thought that if anything happened, we would leave for a few days until things were safe, and then we would come back. We would never have an idea of ever leaving our country, ever, right? And actually, we left. We never came back.
Could you tell us about that moment?
So what it was that my dad asked my mom to prepare food and things, get the children's clothes and everything ready, and it was a little bit of a scramble. So that night, so my dad had a few days, right? So my dad was he had prior knowledge. Okay, so he was one of the people getting stuff ready, but there were many people on top of him that organized this. So he had a chance to go back to Saigon to inform my family that if anything happens, if you wanted to flee, leave the country, you would come down to this port, Mitao, and then we would leave together. So that's my mom's family, and he went to inform his family, because his brother was also in the military, and they didn't think they would ever lose the war, so they never had Plan B, right? So my dad gave them the signal. He said, if you wanted to flee, if you wanted an escape, come down here, stay with us, and then when it was time, we would go together as a family. So in the end, nobody came, because they didn't believe that we had to leave. But my dad it took us into the barracks where he worked that night before. I remember coming into the night, but we were very scared because our Navy compound was in the middle of a very big Army compound. And so if they had known that we were prepared to leave, they would swarm us, and we would be stuck. We would never be able to leave. So everything was done very quietly, in secrecy, right? And so that evening, my dad took our family into the compound. So that I don't even remember which day it was exactly, the 26th or the 25th. We came, and then we went to stay there. And the next day, 3 ships. The ones I was little, I didn't know. I went to visit my dad's work, but these ships you could open up, and they could carry tankers. They were the coolest thing. So 3 big ships, and you could carry tankers and stuff. And that. So in the morning, everybody that was involved in this, they loaded up their family. Okay, it was still okay. Everything was fine. Nothing was going on yet. But you could tell that in a day or so, the country would fall. So if you wanted to leave, you would have a day or two to leave. So everybody packed their kids, their motorbikes, their cars, but there were the generals on top, and they brought their family. And we were lucky because my dad had access to the boats, and so we had first knowledge. So we went on to the ships, and there was no fear, there was no anxiety. I don't know what my parents felt, but my mom probably thought, oh, we'll just go for a few days and we'll come back. And so these little ships, 3 big ships actually, old tankers. So it looks like we went by boat, but the boats we left in were military boats. And so we went, that day we went out to the international waters near the Philippines. So we'd see the Philippines, and we'd see their lights. And then that's where we were picked up by the U.S. Navy boats.
What day was that? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but I remember it wasn't April 30th. It was a few days before that. And for us, it's like a trip. I went to go somewhere with my mom and dad and my family. So it was we didn't know where we were going.
How were the conditions on board?
I was a bad child to be on a boat because I got really sick. So these 3 ships were supplied with gasoline, rice, all the supplies that could keep us afloat for quite a while. And we had a medic, we had a doctor on board, and I was sick. Like we had, I stayed higher up, but I was quite sick, so I was throwing up, and then he had to give me a shot of anti-nauseant to keep us going. So everybody was quite sick. But a day and a night, I believe it was more than a day. And then the next day, we waited out to sea, and then the U.S. ships, they said they were waiting out there. If anybody wanted to go, they would be there. And then we transferred to the bigger ships. And I remember clearly there were helicopters. You see the pictures of helicopter being pushed into the sea? I saw that. Yeah, I didn't think I remember, but I remembered. So my dad was very sad. He lost his country, and he lost his status. He lost everything. And me as a child, I just thought we're going someplace. And my mom was scared. My mom was very scared. She thought, what happens when we have to come back, right? Yeah. The lucky thing for us is when my dad went to Saigon to notify my mom's family if they wanted to come, they would come with us. But my grandfather said, no, nothing will happen to us in Saigon because it's a big city. They will never destroy the city. So he actually sent one of my aunt from Saigon to this Mitol, this little town where we stayed, and he was supposed to bring my family back. My mom and all the kids back to Saigon where we would be safe, and my dad would stay there. So she came, and then the roads were bombed out, and she stayed with us. She couldn't go back to Saigon. So that was the only luck for us, is because had she been able to go back to Saigon, we would have went back with her, and I would have been back in Saigon. My dad would be the only one that would be leaving, right? So she was lucky. She immigrated with us. And because of the one aunt, we were able to bring other people from our family, yeah? And that's all I remember.
How many people on the boat?
Oh, there was quite a bit. So I remember hundreds of people, because each boat can hold quite a bit, right? Yeah, there was a little level, and then all the levels underneath. I was little, so I didn't pay attention.
Were you guys all packed in?
I remember I had a bed because my dad operated the ship, right? But I bet there was quite a few people, a lot of people. But they're all mostly Army, the Navy personnel and their family. But when we went out to international waters, and mostly my dad, we went on to the biggest ship. But some people, they turned the ship around, they went back. They didn't know. They went back home. So my mom had money, right, cash, so she would give them the cash because they didn't want to leave their families. So she gave them the money, and they went back home. So those people were stuck because they didn't realize that we would never be able to go back home. So they went home for their families and their wives. They couldn't leave. But we did go up to the international waters, and those ships, some of them, yeah, they turned back, they went back home.
But she was giving money to the people on the other ships?
Yeah. So we were going on the same ship out, but some of these men, they had families. They said, no, we're not going onto the U.S. boats.
They would dock on the other ships?
Yeah, we're not going there. We're just going to drop you off here, and then we're just going to go back home, right? And so whatever you had, you give to them, but the money was not worth anything, right?
So are they boarded the ships returning?
What it is the little ships, they were moving people onto the big ships, right? Whoever didn't want to come would stay, and then they would go back.
Oh, so this is not in international waters?
This is in international waters. Yeah, we had to make it all the way out, and it was safe. And then out there, after a couple, I think a day or two, then we heard that the country fell, and then there was no way for us to come back, right? So whoever wanted to go home, they still had a chance to go home. Yeah.
And then what next?
And then we went on to the U.S. carrier. I don't remember the name, but it was a very big ship. So there was a hull underneath, and then you could stay on the top deck. And so we went, I don't know how long it would take, maybe a day or a few days. We went to Guam, his little island. We stayed stayed there for a couple of weeks. All I remember was the barracks, the green tent, and rocky beaches and mountains. And then the U.S. Servicemen, they provided food, breakfast, lunch, dinner. It was always canned food. It was like tuna and bread. That's all I remembered. And then everybody had their tent. They supplied with soaps, bedding, sleeping blankets and stuff like that. So it was very chaotic. People didn't know what was going on. Well, we stayed there, and after a couple weeks there, I guess it was a sorting station. Where did you want it to go? So we flew to, we took a plane, I believe. We took a plane. We stopped in Hawaii, Honolulu, I believe, and then the plane took us to Camp Pendleton in the U.S. And we stayed there for a couple weeks, and that was fun too because I was little. So we lined up for food every day, and we lived in these green tents, and they had activities for kids, and that's where they sorted out if you wanted to stay in the U.S. or if you wanted to go to Canada, wherever you wanted to go. So my dad met up with his cousins there, and they wanted to stay in the U.S. But my dad said he wanted to go to Canada because he thought Canada was more of a neutral country and it was easier to make a living and raise children.
Why? Why did he think?
Because he felt betrayed. My dad was a little bit unhappy. He said we lost the war because the American withdrew, and he felt betrayed, and that's why he wanted to go to Canada. That's where he was, and to this day he always thought that was a very good decision because he said the Canadians are very nice, friendly people, and they don't meddle in other people's business. I was too little to know, but he said, see, you lived here all these years. There's no military draft. You didn't have to go to these wars, so he said it was okay. He never regretted his decision, and we've been here 45 years.
And how was it decided where you would live in Canada?
It was easy. He said, I just wanted to go to Canada, and so the government just chose the town where we needed workers. So Edmonton is an oil and gas, so boom town, so they needed workers. So if you couldn't come to Edmonton, you could find, work the same day. So we didn't settle in any other place. So the government chose, he said it doesn't matter where we lived.
What did you know about that? What did you know about Edmonton at the time?
Oh, I didn't know anything. I was a little girl, 8 years old. I thought, when I was on the boat, I said, I heard that the people in the U.S., they're different than us. They're very strange. That we sleep, they would stay awake, okay? And then when we stay awake, they would sleep. I didn't understand there was like a 14-hour time difference. That's all I knew. I didn't know that it was cold. We didn't know anything. But my mom, she knew. She said, oh, it's going to be so cold. And they asked us, are you prepared to come to Canada? It would be cold. Maybe your ears would fall off or you get frostbite. But we came and it was okay. The first few years my mom lived here, she was always afraid. She was always afraid. Like, she didn't believe that Canada would welcome us to stay, forever. We would stay here for a few years, and maybe something happened and we would have to go back home. But there's for years she felt like that. She was always fearful that Canada would not let us stay permanently because we were just refugees until we got our citizenship and we stayed here, and it's been 40-some years, and yeah, we never moved from this place. I asked my dad, would you like to go someplace warmer, like, Richmond? And he's like, no, I like it here. So I have cousins in Richmond, and they asked us to come too, and we said we put roots down here, we're happy here, and we raised a family here, and we're not moving.
Did you receive any assistance from the government or from anybody else when you first arrived?
So my family, we were the first bunch of refugees that came to Edmonton. I clearly remember my mom said it was June 7th or June 8th. We were the first people to come. We came through the government sponsorship. So it was they called it the manpower in those days, not the unemployment office, the manpower. So we came and they picked us up from the airport, and then they put us in a hotel for about a week or so, the North Star Motel downtown. I clearly remember it. it was fun because you know, somebody cleaned the room every day. We had no idea. And so when you're little, you're very carefree. So my mom and dad, we stayed there, and then the next day or two, they would ask us if they could help us find work. There was no organized program for, you know, English training. There was no ESL, anything like that. It was quite a rush thing. The Canadian government wanted to bring these refugees over to help us resettle quite quickly. So my dad, after 2 days, he went to work. He worked at a metal shop place. I guess they started with $2.50 an hour. And all he did was move metal around and car parts and stuff like that. And so my aunt, she went to work at GWG, which is brought over by Levi's. So she sewed jeans for 30 years, and that's how it was. And my mom stayed home. She took care of the kids. So our family was intact. I have my parents and my aunt and my siblings, so I was quite happy. And so I went to school. But there was only 2 or 3 families that came with us, and the rest were all single men, so they missed their family terribly, and they were very lonely. So we had so the government helped us resettle, and they helped us find a house to stay. We stayed downtown, and then we didn't have anything. All we had was some clothes, no furniture, no money of any kind. So the landlord was very nice. He solicited old clothes and houseware. He rented us the house, but he also helped us, you know, stock the house with kitchen utensils and stuff like that. Yeah, so it was nice. We were 8 years old. You didn't know too much.
Did you find your own house? Did you find your own apartment?
It was an old house, and the government helped us. I think my mom said we paid about $200 to stay there, and then there was we didn't know of any Vietnamese people here at all until the journal article came out, and then there was a family here that already established here, so they came to find us, and then they helped us find the Chinese like grocery store to buy rice, and then I don't know if they had fish sauce in those days, but they had you know, soya sauce, and we had rice, and that was good enough. And that family gave us a helping hand, so we could buy, instead of buying instant rice at the corner grocery. So we started with that, and so my mom and dad had this rented this home, and so every weekend my mom would cook. She would cook pho. She would cook food, because there were a lot of single men that came and they had no family, and so our house would be more like a refuge for them to, you know, get to know other refugees. And then every month or so, more refugees would come. They would come to the same North Star motel, so my parents would make the trip there, introduce them, you know, to life in Canada, and if they needed any help, if they needed anything, my parents would be the first thing they would ask. And we would do that as volunteer, and we became a little family, because there wasn't any restaurant, there wasn't any pho, so they got to know each other there. It was very interesting. I was probably about 9 years old. We stayed downtown for maybe a year. I went to school. I started grade 1. Yeah, so I was put back a couple years, so I started grade 1. So as a 7, 8 years old, 8 years, you can remember a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how we started. So it was a very small community. Everybody knew everybody. So very few people were lucky enough to have families. So these people missed their wives, missed their parents, missed terribly. And in those days, in the early 70s, 75s, there was no way you could communicate with your family back home. There was no letters at that time. You just had a feeling of loss, because you've lost your country, you've lost your family. Right? It wasn't until years later where there was communication where you could send letters back and forth. And so those letters that came from home were very, very precious, right? Yeah, and we had no way. They didn't know if we were alive, and we didn't know how they were doing back home either.
And just to so I can clarify, it was thanks to the crew from the Edmonton Journal who came to wrote about you that you you were put in touch with other Vietnamese families.
Yes.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have known.
We would have known, because we were the first group to come, and nobody knew that we came, right? So because of that article, somebody came and they found us, and we're still lifelong friends till this day. And they introduced us to the groceries, and if you needed some help, and that's how it started. Yeah.
And did your parents ever go back to take any kind of training?
My mom never. I think she just raised children, and my dad, there was no organized ESL classes or anything like that. But he went to work right away. The lucky thing was I was very grateful that my dad and my family came, because in 1975 my dad was quite ill. He had hyperthyroidism, and he was quite ill. He was like, when he came to Canada, he was like 90 pounds. So had we stayed and had we not had a chance to immigrate, I would have lost my father in 1975. It would have never survived those re-education camps. We have never would have made it. But by the grace of God, we came to this country, and I guess healthcare in those days were quite generous. So the first thing is, when we came to Edmonton, he was ill, so they admitted him to the Royal Alex downtown, and they kept him for a couple weeks, and they did all kinds of testing on him, and they found out that his thyroid was hyperactive, and they gave him one radioactive iodine capsules, and that fixed him to this day. And then he has been healthy all this time. So I have to say, Canada gave us a chance for my family to have my dad for an extra 45 years still. Yeah, there was no other way he would have made it if we stayed, if we've never made it. So a little bit of luck along the way, a little bit, right?
And what line of work did he stay in?
My dad became a mechanic assistant, so he's very handy. So he never had any formal education. He spoke very little English. My mom didn't speak any English. So he worked in a metal shop, and then he became, we did odd jobs, right? He installed windows for the longest time, and he became a mechanic assistant. He did odd jobs to raise the children.
Repair cars?
Yeah, repair cars, and his hobby was fixing cars, updating cars, and he was okay. He lost quite a bit, right? For a man to lose his job and his country, he lost quite a bit. He was kind of, it took him many years to get used to Canada. Whereas my mom, she embraced this country. She was very happy. She was like, well, Canada gave us another chance, an opportunity to raise my children, in peace. There was no war. We had a chance of going to school. She was very, very happy about that. And so she learned English. She learned how to drive. That took many, many years. But she was always fearful. She said, the children we're so little, right? How would we have a chance to survive in this country? But she was always fearful. What would we have to do to survive in this country, right? And then, school was okay for us. We did all right. We went to university. All of us were university educated, so we did well. She was very happy how we turned out. She was very proud.
So once she stopped being fearful, she embraced her life?
That's right. Yeah, she said, anything happened, they would send us back home, and then after 5 years we got our citizenship, and then we work, and then the government at that time, after about 4 or 5 years, we were very poor, basic, day-to-day living. But the government in those days had a program where they would help you buy a piece of land, and they would help you buy a home. And so that's how we got our first home. They supplied it with a very low mortgage. So instead of renting for $220 or $225, they would give us a mortgage for 40 years. And so that's how they started us. That's how they got their first home. Otherwise, we would never be able to afford a home. So that program many years ago for new immigrants and low income. So that's how we had a house in Millwood, south of the city, and that was how we lived. And she just happy to raise the children. She didn't think of anything more. And we came and we went to school. We didn't think of the long term, right? We just wanted to live in peace and have a quiet life.
And can you describe the difficulties that your dad had, like the attitudinal difficulties?
He felt like he lost a lot. It was a culture shock. Okay, he had status back home. He had a job, and then he had his position. He belonged, but here it was totally a culture shock. So we had to start with nothing. We had very little.
So how would that display itself?
He, I don't remember him causing us too much problem, but a little bit displaced. My mom always had a job. My mom always stayed home, took care of the children. That was her job. But his job was to go to work and raise. But I don't think he ever expressed to me what the sense of loss that he had. And it took him a few years. So my mom slowly had to, adapt him to this culture. Like men worked and women also worked too, right? So they had to start slowly changing him. If you would help around the house a bit more, because in Asia he was the king. He went to work, my mom would do everything at home, and he wouldn't have to help around the house at all. So slowly the Canadian culture, we had to adapt to that. But it was not too hard. We didn't have too many issues. And they raised us, we went to school, there was not issues. But my dad was involved in starting, one of the people that helped to start this association. Okay, because in those days there was very few people. And we're Catholic, so my dad was one of the people in charge to organize, like, we didn't have a priest here, a Vietnamese priest here, so we organized Mass once a month. So once a month we had Mass, so everybody would go and we'd have a Catholic priest, and that's how it started, very slowly, until we had our own church, until we had our own priest. And he was with some of the elders who started this association.
The Vietnamese, the Edmonton Vietnamese Association.
One of the few seniors that started, and the community was very small in those days, right? So
where was Mass held?
the Mass held when we were downtown. It was Sacred Heart Church, and once a month we would have a priest. I don't know if he came from Calgary, okay, and then we would do Mass once a month for us. And then later on, our community grew. We had more refugees come, and then there came a time where we were allowed to have our own church, and we had our own priest, and so that's how it started.
How long do you think it took for your parents to feel at home in Canada?
Maybe years, maybe 7, 8 years, 10 years. Okay, so when we came, it was quite isolated because I was the one or two of the only children that is Vietnamese in my school. There was no other Vietnamese students. So we lived very quietly. We lived like after when we come, we lived in the downtown area. And once we settled, we went to the suburbs, right? Smaller town, and there was nobody that spoke our language. We felt really isolated. So my mom said there was no way we could teach our children Vietnamese, because as soon as you went to school, you would forget everything. So my brothers and sisters started kindergarten, so we spoke English most of the time. So I lost a lot of my speaking skill. So whatever my parents would say, I would understand, but I would never be able to respond. But because I was 8, I remember quite a bit. My younger siblings, they probably could not communicate very well until I met my husband, and then he was older. Then he taught me some more Vietnamese. But that was quite a lonely time for them. But whatever refugees that came, we kind of embraced them as family. So we treated them like family, yeah, because there were so few of us. Yeah, I don't know where, how the government decided where to settle people. So either in Vancouver or Toronto or Edmonton. But Edmonton was very easy to find work, so that's why a lot of people came here.
If you look back now, what were some of the biggest obstacles and struggles that your family faced?
I think it was more of a job. Okay, we didn't have trades, so we did just labor work. Okay, and then we didn't have anybody to really help us. So Manpower found us a job. You got a job and you worked and you raised your kids, but there was no other program to help you learn the trades. So if you wanted to learn English, you have to do that by yourself. So later on, when more people came, then they came up with some type of a program to help you learn English and get a trade later. So that's how we started. There was nothing very organized at all.
So a lack of settlement services?
Yeah, it was so new, right? It was so new, nobody knew.
And by the way, what you finished school and then you went on to university? Where did you go from there?
So I went to Sacred Heart School, which is across from the church. I went there grade 1, and then we went to elementary. I went to high school, and then I always knew that my mom always said, you probably have to try hard to get an education here. So I always knew I wanted to do something, but not exactly what. So we just went to university, and we just chose a career, whichever career that was easy to find work. There was not any one particular career that she said we had to try.
And what did you guys end up in?
I took pharmacy. My brothers took computing science, and I have another sister that's a pharmacist, and I have engineers. We have a lot of engineers now. So my aunt that came with us, she was a very important person, because my dad made very little money, just enough to raise one family. So my aunt was able to sponsor family later on, because her family had, she got married, she had less children. So our family came with one aunt, and then slowly we sponsored other families. So our family here was probably about 40, 50 people here in this family now. So my grandma came, my other aunts came, and my cousins came. So our family here is quite big.
When were they first sponsored over?
So probably, I'm not sure exactly when they came. Well, probably when I was in high school. So in the 80s, maybe 84, 85. Maybe after that, because before there was no way to sponsor your family, and they would only let you sponsor, let's say, your parents, right? So my aunt sponsored my grandma, because my grandma was 60 something, and so I have to say we're very lucky. So they said you can't sponsor brother, sister. There was no way. So they said if you have a mother, you can sponsor her. So my aunt said, okay, I have enough income, I can sponsor grandma. So she did the paperwork. The Canadian government said family reunification. So we did the paperwork to sponsor grandma. But lucky, my grandma lived with my youngest aunt, and she had one child and her husband. And so when the Canadian immigration interviewed my grandma, and they asked, you're an elderly lady, why do you want to come to Canada? She said, I wanted to come to see my daughters. So she had 2 daughters in Canada, my mom and my aunt. I said, why do you want to come? I want to come to see my daughters. But they said, so if you leave you leave Vietnam to come to Canada, won't you miss your daughter in Vietnam? And my grandma says, yes, of course, I'll miss her, because I've lived with her all my life. So the Canadian immigration was very, very nice. They said, why don't you do the paperwork, and then we'll let your whole family, the other aunts, come. So that's how they came.
You all came together?
They all came together. They didn't have to go by boat. They just came.
And not even one by one. It was just the whole group.
So my grandma came with her youngest daughter, and then slowly there was another aunt that came, and so that's how our family grew. So I always felt complete, because I have my mom and my dad, and then I had my aunts and uncles, and I had my grandma. So I never felt displaced. I always felt like this was where you belong, because your home is your family, right?
And what did your aunt do for a living?
My aunt, the one that came with us, she worked at GWG for 37 years, and she sewed, and she worked there until I think she retired. And my other aunts, they came, they did odd jobs, manufacturing, things like that. And some of my uncle, they had an opportunity to learn a trade. They were welders, like that. That was luckier, right? If you had a trade after. And that's how we did. But my mom was very happy. She just hoped the children would go to school, have a better degree, a better job. And so she didn't think much of her life. She said, I can sacrifice, I can do whatever that was necessary, so my children wouldn't have to do the same kind of job that I did. And so she was very hopeful for the next generation.
So looking back, how do you feel about the life that you've created in Canada?
I'm very grateful. I'm very happy that the Canadian government was very generous, right, to sponsor all these refugees to come, because every country would volunteer how many refugees they would take, right? And so they needed workers. We came, we stayed, we worked, and we prospered in this country. It was not a hard adjustment for me because I was little, but I'm sure if you were older, you came and you didn't have a chance to go to school or learn English as well. So I came as a child, so it was an easy adjustment, and I came with your family, so you didn't feel displaced, right? And so I had no issues with separation or attachment. But some of my friends that came later, they came without their parents. They had a harder time. They missed their family. They remembered enough. As a little child, you don't remember, you didn't experience enough back home, so you didn't miss that when you came. So this is your life here. And so, but many years later, when I went back to Vietnam, I found it very strange too, because I didn't find that Vietnam was my country. I felt I felt like a tourist. Yeah, it felt really strange. You didn't feel like you're Vietnamese anymore because you're not Vietnamese enough. But you live here for so many years, you adapted to here. But sometimes you didn't feel like you completely belong here either, because we were small. Our community here is not that big, so sometimes we're a little bit secluded. But the children that we have, our children, they actually adapted. They blended in better than us.
Do you talk about your experiences leaving Vietnam and settling here with your children?
Yeah, sometimes I tell them, they're like, first of all, they always complain, why do we live here? It's so cold. And they don't understand what type of Asian we are, right? So there's Chinese, there's Vietnamese, there's Laotians. They don't understand. They're never curious enough to ask why we settled here. And I always tell them, we're Vietnamese. We came here because of Grandpa and Grandma, and we're refugees. We came here, and we've lived here for a long time, and this is quite a nice place to raise children. But they've never asked for any more. But in school, in social studies, you studied history. So they have a paragraph about the Vietnam War. That's all there was. The war in 1975, the country lost, and we came to this country, but very little was taught. So anything that you wanted to teach your children would be through this cultural association. You would meet other Vietnamese, you would learn about their culture. But the children, I always ask them, you should try hard, go to school. Grandpa and Grandma made a big sacrifice to come here, to give us a chance to live in peace and to raise your family free, right? My dad always wanted to live in a country that was free. Yeah, it didn't matter, but my mom was very happy. My dad, who's been here so long, and he's very happy. And we could have lived actually in the U.S. We could have lived anywhere, but actually this is quite a nice, peaceful place to live.
And what do you think that they can learn from your experiences and from Canada's refugee program, the new generation?
What it is now, Canada is such an open and welcoming place. We had problems, adapting when we started. There was racism back when I was little. We didn't speak the language. We dressed, differently, and the communication was an issue. We were poor, and it took us a long time. But the children now that we raise are totally different. They have no idea that we went through all that, and our parents had to work very hard to raise us. And for me, at 7, 8 years old, 9 years, I remember some of the early years. But my children, I don't think experienced any of that. Totally different, the way they grow up. And even the experience between myself coming when I was little and my husband when he came as a teenager, his experience would be totally different than mine. And my children have no idea. what we went through. So we tell them, and then we show them pictures, but they actually don't until. So my children are older now. So I took my 18-year-old son back to Asia a couple years ago, and he said, "This is not so bad, Mom. They have KFC, they have Jollibee. Everything was not as bad as what you said." So we went back to Vietnam 20 some years ago, and from then till now it has changed quite a bit. And my dad said, "Oh, you know, it's a very dangerous place. It was the roads were, you know, fraught with you to travel from one city to the other would be such a big trip." And so when we come back, you know, it was the life's changed quite a bit than what we had before. And so my parents remember something totally different. And I remember when I come back, I remember something very different. The country has improved so much over the last little while. But I believe that the Canadian government gave us such an opportunity to come and have such a good life here. And I tried to tell my children that, yeah, and take the opportunity. And then with the new refugees or the new immigrants that come, we, you know, everybody has a chance, right? So that opportunity is what you make of it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your story. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, okay.